Flight attendants, both past and present. What's the most entitled behavior you've seen from passenger? Story 1, I'm a passenger, not a flight attendant, but it's a good story nonetheless. I was on a flight from NYC to PDX. Only empty seat was next to me, a middle seat bulkhead, but the kind where there isn't a wall, just the first-class seats in front of us. Door is about to close when a large, sweaty man comes running onto the plane to claim the empty seat. He was carrying a full-size pizza box. All overhead bins were already closed and full, but that didn't stop him from proceeding to open them to find a place to stash his pizza. The stewardess kindly informed him that he couldn't put his pizza in an overhead bin, but ITL gets stepped on. He gruffly informs her. She proceeded to tell him to take his seat and put the pizza in front of him. He told her that he flies with pizza all the time and has never been treated this way. He persisted, but as their argument was getting pretty heated, he finally succumbed and put the pizza under the seat in front of him and sat down. The stewardesses have now started the safety video demonstration, and he pulls out a flip phone and proceeds to make a call. I can tell he's going through menus, so I'm thinking he's calling Delta to complain. Nope, turns out to be his landline phone company. He had been late paying his bill and was trying to get them to waive the late fee. They wouldn't. He is arguing with them. Plane is pushed back from the gate and is headed toward the runway at this point. Stewardess comes over and tells him he needs to put his phone away now. He motions with his hand to say, 1 minute. No, sir, it needs to be put away now. He flips it shut dramatically mid-sentence and puts it in his pocket. Stewardess is back to the front of the plane. He then decides to stretch and pretty much plaster to the wall, trying to stay out of his way as he extends his arms up and then to the side, etc. And then twists in his seat back and forth, clearly agitated. He then extends his arms up, stretches out his fingers, and proceeds to crack his knuckles very expressively one at a time, sort of like a primary school bully would do on the playground before they were going to kick you. In that whole knuckle-cracking process, he flips a middle finger toward the flight attendant. I didn't notice a reaction as I was just waiting to get this 6-hour flight underway and over with. Next thing I know, I could tell we're pulling back into the gate. Flight attendants prepare for arrival and cross-check message. Door opens, cockpit door opens. Captain comes to our row. Sir, I understand you were harassing my flight attendant. I need you to leave the plane now. The pizza man attempted to argue and even ask me and the other neighboring passenger if we had witnessed anything. Clearly the pilot wasn't budging on his decision, so the guy got his pizza off the floor and left the plane. Door closed, and we departed. Empty seat next to me. Story 2, not one specific passenger, but a type of behavior I've unfortunately seen too much of. Couple will book separate seats. The man in a premium economy seat with extra leg room. The woman in a normal economy seat. The woman will then play the sad sack and ask another passenger to give up their comfy seat so they can sit together. If the other passenger refuses, usually because they paid extra and literally don't fit in a regular seat. Some will even complain to the crew to make them move the other passenger, and all this to save a few bucks on the second premium seat. Edit seeing, as a lot people asked, no, crew don't move passengers because they're sitting next to someone else's spouse, and certainly not from a premium economy seat. Story 3 was on a Vegas to Boston flight when a passenger passed away in his sleep. The whole situation was heartbreaking, and the flight attendants were clearly shaken. We stopped in New York for emergency personnel to attend to him. The whole process was very quick, and the pilot and staff handled it like champs. Just as we were about to take off, a guy in the front row asked the attendant if we would all get free drinks due to the inconvenience. I've never wanted to yell at a stranger so much in my life. Story 4, every so often we get the odd straggler who boards last who find a vacant seat in first or business thinking that we won't know that they are from coach. Excuse me, sir, may I see your boarding pass? Sorry, your seat is 58A, not 1A, but I'm so tall, I need the leg room. Awkward silence. Story 5, not a flight attendant, but fly a lot, and I was on a plane where half the plane were ignoring the rules and stuff. When we touched down, these people immediately got up walking around and started taking their bags out of the overheads. Mind you, the plane hasn't parked, it's just literally touched the floor of the landing strip. So it's still moving, and it's dangerous for half the people on the plane to be around. And even worse, taking all their heavy bags down above everyone else's heads. The flight attendants are now desperately trying to get these people to sit down until the plane stops moving, and some people were waving their hands at them dismissively. I think the captain heard the commotion and the flight attendants half yelling, because all of a sudden the plane did a very abrupt stop which knocked over all the people standing up and then continued to park. The flight attendant then said, "This is exactly why we have rules, LOL." Story 6, I'm 6 tall, with most of the length in my legs, and I fly a lot, so I've run into or two. Almost every plane I get in, my knees are already touching the seat in front of me. If the person in front of me reclines, the only way for me to sit is to straighten out my legs and shoot them underneath the seat in front of me. I was probably 16, still 6, and the guy in front of me couldn't have been more than 24. He reclines, and his seat practically hits me in the chest. I could smell his hair. He was so close. We asked him to put the seat up a bit, but he declined. The seat was clearly broken and reclined a good 6 inches past the other seats in his row. So we called over the flight attendant. She also saw the problem and asked him to put his seat up and told him it was broken. He said no, and she said there was nothing else she could do. Great, thanks. Luckily, my mom is the pack everything you may need on a plane mom. So I get an idea. I start eating pretzels with my mouth wide open and get crumbs all over his head and shoulders. He doesn't notice until the crumbs are bouncing off his shoulder crumbs and into his lap. It was gross. He turns around with a look of disgust and asks me to stop. I got great pleasure in telling him no and showing him the rest of the bag of pretzels. I had to eat over him. He put the seat up. Story 7, the comments I'm getting are from some real numb idiots who don't realize that rules vary by region, and it's an old rule that doesn't exist anymore. That's why you never heard of a dummy. Also, if you think this rule is dumb, did you know your electronics don't disrupt the plane's electronics? That rule about using airplane mode is pretty dumb. Flight attendant, can you please open your blind all the way? It's regulation for landing. Passenger, no. I want to close. This goes on for a minute. P is using his tone to assert that he refuses to open it. F8 speed walks to the handset, and her voice comes on over the PA. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to play some trivia today. The question is, why do we keep the blinds open during takeoff and landing? And without letting anyone answer, she jumps right into it so we can all keep an eye on the outside of the plane for safety. Click. Story 8, I was a kid flying out to Utah to start my teen tour. About halfway through the flight, departing out of New York, the captain got on the speaker to announce an engine had failed and we needed to make an emergency landing in Chicago. Needless to say, we got a little concerned, except for one passenger who stormed up to the flight attendant and explained she was a nanny and needed to get to Utah to attend to the children she took care of. I'm not exactly sure what she was hoping, that the pilot, upon hearing that a babysitter was on board, would risk the lives of everyone to fly us all through, or that the flight attendant would be so moved by this story that she would climb out on the wing and repair the engine mid-flight. Alas, there was no emergency jetpack to give this passenger to blast away from the plane to get to Utah on time, and she was told to sit down. Story 9, my girlfriend's mom is a flight attendant. One time a woman got quite angry because her daughter spilled apple juice all over, and there was not a clothes dryer on the plane for her daughter's sweater. Story 10, I once flew from Chicago to Israel, very long flight, with a stop in the middle, with a woman who didn't seem to understand that everyone around her was in the same situation she was in. She dropped a number of passive-aggressive gems over the course of her day together. But the worst one was right when we were being seated for the first leg. The plane was one of those 3x5x3 setups, with aisles on each side of the 5-seat section, and this woman was seated in the middle of the 5-seat section. But you can't seat me in the middle. What if I need to get up and walk around and the people next to me are asleep? It'll be very uncomfortable for this whole flight. Wow. Lady, you figured out why flying kind of sucks all by yourself. Now sit down and start pretending you're not here like the rest of us. Edit, it might have been 2x5x2. Edit, I was not aware before I made this comment that knowing stats about commercial airline coach seating configuration was a hobby for people. This flight happened like 12 years ago. I'm sorry, I don't remember for sure. Also, I'm a woman. Story 11, a few years ago, I was on a flight with a little girl and her 2 parents behind me. About 10 minutes after takeoff, the little girl started kicking my seat, and so I turned around and asked her to stop because it was rude. After she didn't listen, I turned around to the parents, but they were both on their phones when the dad looked at me and demanded to know why I was talking to his daughter. I said she was kicking my seat, and he yelled at me to turn around, so you did. For the rest of the flight, he instructed his daughter to kick my seat, even when I told her to knock it off. He didn't even have headphones in, so we'll be able to hear what I said to her. Honestly, what is wrong with some people? Edit obligatory, wow, this blew up. But seriously, I can't believe how many people saw this. Story 12, flying in and out of D.C., we always have air marshals. One time the agents let them down early. When the first passengers started arriving, a wealthy-looking older couple came on, and the woman started demanding to know who those men were that boarded before them. Her husband claimed they paid extra to be the first passengers on board, which is absurd, because we always let wheelchair passengers and other specials down first. So I calmly explained to her that they were invited down by the captain because they were veterans in the Wounded Warrior Project. That shut her right up for the rest of the flight. I can't imagine the mindset that allows a person to think they're so entitled they deserve to sit down on a shitty airplane seat before any other person. Story 13, passenger. Went on an 8-hour flight to Florida, a family of 5 boarded first, and then demanded the attendants rearrange their kids' seats to all be together. I get him a mom now, too. but they occupied my seat. In fact, the entire row, while the flight attendant tried to arrange them to all sit together. I politely asked them to let us sit down, and they just ignored us. Asked again, and they said no, we were waiting for our seats, and that I could probably wait at the back of the plane. I just crossed my arms and stared them down. I held up the whole plane, and I do feel bad about that. But I made it clear it was the entitled family that was the holdup, and not me. They finally moved to go wait at the back of the plane. I can't stand people that think they're higher class just because they have kids at it. I had no problem with them wanting to be seated together. They most likely specified that, and the airline probably messed up. Happens all the time. I had no problem with them boarding first, although family priority seating is mainly to make things go smoothly. The obvious entitlement was that they occupied a seat that I paid for, refused to move, and then told me that I should wait in the back holding my luggage until their accommodation was made because they were too good for that, and so much more important. Story 14, not an attendant, but once got stranded at Newark for 22 hours after our flight had an unfixable fault and was canceled late at night. We got put up in a hotel, but understandably by the time the new flight rolled around earliest they could fit in a new flight, everyone was quite tired and agitated. As we were waiting to board the new flight, the flight attendant announces they would be boarding people with additional needs and families with young children first, followed by first class, then premium economy, etc., etc. All pretty standard stuff. Obviously it could take a bit longer for people in wheelchairs to board, so it makes sense for them to go on first. It's common on most airlines, I believe. Anyway, this business dude races to the front of the crowd and starts yelling at the attendant, saying it was already disgusting that he had lost a day due to their incompetence, and now he had to wait even longer despite being a first-class passenger and paying every year to fly with them. The worst part is he's looking at others in the crowd to back him up. Like it's perfectly reasonable to scream at this woman who, like us, had also been stranded and had most likely had very little sleep and was doing her best to do her job in this difficult situation. But she was awesome. Without missing a beat, she smiled and nodded and said, "Okay, sir," then made a big point of leaning into her mic and telling the waiting line of people in wheelchairs and mothers with babies that this gentleman needed to board before them. And could they please wait? Literally, every single person at the gate is looking at this guy with disgust as he tries to backtrack and say he doesn't mind waiting for the first group. But the attendant says, no, you made yourself quite clear. Let's get you boarded. The others will have to wait. He is humiliated as he sheepishly walks by. She handled it perfectly. Story 15, just a passenger on Southwest with no assigned seats. I just love when a mom and her 4 kids are last aboard a full flight, and each kid is carrying a bag of McDonald's. The mom starts shouting that she and her kids need to sit together, and people who boarded the plane 20 minutes ago need to move. I would love to shout back, no, you needed to pack sandwiches and snacks, and have been in line during family boarding. Story 16, I had someone have a meltdown because I had to have them properly stow their wedding dress. The thing was massive and spilling into the aisle, blocking seats of the entire row. They may have had to pay the hotel to get the wrinkles out, but I likely saved them from shoe prints and beverage cart rollers going back and forth over it. Still, she was in tears, and I was not going to risk others' safety, including my own. Story 17, currently on an airplane, and saw a man berate the flight attendant because they let employees of the airline board before the customers. He was so angry because he paid for business select. They didn't pay for, so why are they boarding before me? Flight attendant responded with its company policy. Many are actually working and just need to get to the airport they'll be leaving from. And there's also only 3 on the flight, so what's the big deal anyway? He continued to whine and complain to her for another 10 minutes or so, all because now there were only 140 seats to choose from instead of 143. Boo-hoo dash. Story 18, not an FA, but a passenger. 19 years ago, my grandma had passed away, got the soonest flight back that I could San Francisco airport to the UK, missed the funeral as Jewish, left behind somewhat unresolved love at the airport. So there's me, miserable AF, eyes constantly leaking. I tilt my seat back so I could try to sleep on this 8-hour flight of sadness. Loudmouthed idiot behind me shoves my seat back up SRSLY hard, like full-on BM, starts banging onto his moron mate and their moron wives' house C. I showed them, outrageous, trying to shove their seat into my lap, blah blah blah, fat bastard cakes. Proceeded to shove his knees into the back of my seat, so I couldn't put the seat back at all, continues to laugh loudly about how amazing he is for not letting me encroach on his space, then starts dribbling on about how his holiday had been ruined by all the foreigners and getting ripped off, and him not tipping no one. Why should I JFC? FA comes over, she'd seen it all go on, leans over to me and apologizes that it's a full flight, so she can't move me, but how about a drink? Passes me the first of many free drinks. gives moron and the moron clan the most epic hard stare I've ever seen. Moron 1 quiets down and proceeds to ignore them, and their calls the entire flight, as far as I know. I passed out shortly after from the 2 free scotches, but honestly, thank you to that FA. She made a truly awful experience manageable. If that moron is still out there flying, I apologize for my entire country. Story 19, not an attendant, but was on a flight with really bad turbulence. It went on for about 10 minutes, then the old lady next to me reaches up and presses her button. Attendant walks over to see if the woman is okay. The woman begins to yell at the attendant for the rough flight, and that she's been flying her whole life, and clearly the pilot has no idea what he's doing. The stewardess just walked away. Story 20, not me, but my sister is a flight attendant. A well-known actress on board her flight expected the flight crew to change her kid's diaper. They didn't. Story 21, am currently a flight attendant, and on my very first flight, I had a passenger complain to me that the man behind him was snoring too loudly. Putting on my best customer service smile, I offered to move the complainer, who very aggressively told me that head paid for his seat, and he wasn't moving, yelling loudly enough that he woke the snoring guy in the process. I wish ID had a first-class seat available to move the snoring guy, just to spite the complainer, but there were only other economy seats available. So I just told the complainer that he could continue yelling at me, or he could accept my offer of a different seat, but that was all I could do for him. I ended up giving the snorer free drinks for the rest of the flight. Story 22, a friend of mine is a pilot for a North American airline. Don't want to say which one, and there was a passenger on the plane from India, and during the flight, he kept being rude and extremely disrespectful to the female flight attendants. So halfway into the flight, one of them finally got fed up and confronted him asking what his problem was and how they could find a middle ground. He responded with saying, in my culture, women are supposed to be slaves for the men, and she responded with, well, in my culture, you're a taxi driver. He proceeds to lose his, and they had to restrain him in his seat. Nothing happened to the flight attendant, because they all thought he was being so disrespectful he deserved it. Story 23, I once watched a very well-dressed businessman have an epic toddler-level tantrum at a check-in counter when he was advised his flight was delayed due to fog. He literally screamed and jumped up and down and demanded that the airline better do something about it or else. The guy working behind the counter just smirked and suggested that business guy was welcome to go outside and try and flap the fog away with his arms. Entire queue burst out laughing. Story 24, not a FA, but had the opportunity to help out a couple back in the day. A fellow passenger across the aisle pretty much thought he was flying private instead of being on a commercial carrier. Always pressing the overhead button and making demands, no pleases, not a thank you, just a constant barrage of orders. The end came when he pressed the button and shouted, "Give me a drink now, I want a scotch with a splash of soda and not too much ice." The FA was very accommodating in spite of this person being a total. She brings the drink, hands it to him, and he bellows, "There's too much ice in this drink, make me another." She was dumbfounded and at this point very flustered. She turned around and headed to the galley at the front of the plane. The lead FA comes back and proceeds to tell this man that he needs to behave, etc. Well, that just made him amp it up. Wait for it. Do you know who I'm a very good long-time friend of Mr. X. You know him, one of executives at your airline. He's a personal friend whom I've known for years. Give me your name and the name of the idiot who can't make a decent scotch and soda. I chime in at this point, sir, if Mr. X is a long-time personal friend, what is his nickname? His very good friends address him with his nickname, not his surname. He looks perplexed and then tells me to mind my business. The FA tells me very nicely to not involve myself, and she will handle this. He says, "You're God right, you better handle this." I reached into my wallet and pulled out a picture taken on my wedding day that had me in my suit, the new wife in her wedding dress, and my new in-laws, one of whom is Mr. X. I handed it to the FA and said that I will call the office when we land and let him know that one of his very good friends is dropping his name and treating members of flight crew in a very unprofessional manner. Sir, may I have your name so I can tell my father-in-law that you're going to make a formal complaint against members of the cabin crew? Crickets. Nay, but a peep. The lead FA hands me back my picture and tells the guy if he touches the button again or even speaks to any of the FAs, the police will be waiting for him when we land. I called the father-in-law after we landed to fill him in. Just in case, I found out much later that he pulled the passenger manifest and wrote the guy a letter banning him from traveling on the airline. Story 25, I was a passenger, not an attendant, but the story still stands. About a year ago on a flight from SAC to C, a woman with a service dog came on the plane. She sat in the front row of seats on a Southwest flight. After pre-boarding, a very drunk man, his wife, and their baby came on the plane. The man demanded that the woman with the service dog move because he wanted the front seats for his family. When she told him she would not move, he began grabbing her bags and throwing them in the aisle, The attendants came and told him that he could not move a passenger's seat. He then grabbed the service dog by the harness and began yanking it out into the aisle. The woman was crying at this time, begging for help. The man was told that if he continued, he and his family would have to deboard the plane. The man finally stopped, but put his carry-on in the bin above where the woman was sitting before taking a seat further back. The entire flight, there were complaints that his wife was holding their baby on the tray table, who was pulling the passenger's hair in front of them. She was changing diapers in the seat and disgustingly storing them in the seat pocket in front of them. When the plane landed, the man and his wife pushed through the aisles yelling that they needed their carry-on, and in the process, shoved a woman with a full leg brace and a cane back in her seat. They were removed from the plane, though it was too late. The damage had already been done. This was by far the worst set of passengers I have ever encountered on a plane. Story 26 mid-90s, there was this kid in Customs Toronto to Houston flight who was going nuts. He driving people crazy in the departure area. On the flight, he had a full-size metal Tonka truck that he was running up and down the aisle with. He smacked me on the head and nearly hit my mom in front of me. I grabbed it before he could hit my very frail and on blood thinners mom. I gave it to a crew member who refused to give it back to the family. The family refused to seat him until it was announced that there would be no food or beverage service until the aisle was cleared. Another woman grabbed the kid and returned him to his family. They let him run loose again as soon as service was over. Finally, someone from the cockpit had to come back and tell the family we couldn't start the landing approach until the brat was in his seat. They put him in his seat, screaming murder. As soon as descent started, they let him up, and he was running up and down the aisle as we landed. The family was so dense that when the captain ordered everyone to stay in their seats, and that only families with small children would be allowed to deplane at first, they smirked their way down the aisle. Mom walked with a cane, and the crush getting off was hard for her. Since we were home, we just waited till the aisles were clear. When we got off, you could hear the kids screaming 12-way down the jetway. A police officer was holding him, and the rest of the family, I'm guessing mom, dad, and 2 grandparents were in handcuffs. Story 27, my mom was a flight attendant in her 20s. Asked her for a story. Her first week flying, there was a group of drunk men on the flight. At one point, when returning to quiet them down again, one of the fellows had his wang out on full display for her in all its flaccid glory. She says to him very politely and a bit taken aback, "Why don't you put that away now?" And this drunken man flat out says to her, "Why don't you put away for me?" With the most revolting smug smile on his face, my mom says in her exact words, "I'd be happy to do that for you, but you'd never be able to use it again." Seems like that happened, but my mom has always had the most ridiculous stories that always turn out to be true. They'll take her word for the story. Story 28 had a passenger a couple of rows in front of me aggressively asking the attendant for alcohol. We were still loading at the time. He was warned twice. Just as we were pushing back from the gate, he was given his final warning by the senior attendant. As she walked away, he swore at her. She turned round and told her we were going back to the gate, and he was getting off. And we did 20 minutes for his luggage to go, and we were off again. I congratulated her at the end and emailed BA to say how well I thought she had handled it. Story 29, not a flight attendant, but a few years ago, my wife and I were going down to Mexico for a friend's wedding. I just remember seeing a young lady getting very flustered at the ticket counter. She was demanding a seat next to her husband. As we started to board the flight, an attendant pulled my wife aside to say she had a seat change. We knew exactly what it was about and just laughed. We were very flexible and just excited for the trip at max, maybe 3 hours. So as I settle into my seat, the before-mentioned adult child comes and sits next to me. She started the small talk with how the airlines are so mean and they had the hardest time getting seats next to each other. I just causally mentioned, "Yeah, I know my wife was supposed to be in your seat, but someone threw a fit about it." Overall, good flight. They kept to themselves. I hope those two are divorced now. Story 30. So like Harry's a good one. I still am, but working on a fat guy. My new employer sent me out to the UK. Admittedly, I understand that being fat makes flying with me a pitta. To my benefit, though I do try and squeeze myself into a corner or out into the aisle. Whatever I can do to minimize the frustration of my neighbor. I don't put the seats back. I don't use the table. I ask if they want the window raised or lowered if I'm a window seat. I don't talk. Eat. Get up to use the restroom. I don't use the restroom at all on flights. This included the 12 or some odd hour flight to Heathrow. Essentially, I understand how to fly with, and I do my absolute best to minimize your hatred of me, which I admittedly deserve. To that end, however, I remember flying out of Heathrow, and about 20 minutes into the air, the guy looks over at me and says, "This isn't going to work." I looked at him back and said, "I'm sorry." He stated, "Look, this isn't going to be a comfortable flight for either of us. One of us needs to move," and looks pointedly at me. I tell him I'm sorry. I can't fix this right now. So he hits the light and calls out, "Excuse me, ma'am," to the flight attendant at the front of the class cabin. She comes back, and he says as loudly as he can, without actually shouting, "Look, I have a problem with this guy here. One of us needs to move, and it should be him." To her credit, she surveyed the cabin and saw only middle row seats were available and seemed to understand the situation. "Sir, you may move to any of these open seats," looking at him. Now again, I know I'm going to take flack on here, but the reality is that people are fatter than they were 30 to 60 years ago. They're also taller. Airlines maximize money by packing more people into a smaller area. I don't enjoy being that guy, but I didn't know even 3 weeks out that I was going to be flying to the UK. Not much I could have changed in 3 weeks, oh well. Story 31, my cousin is a flight attendant. In one flight, he was serving on an A380 marvel of a plane. This airline had private suites of sorts on the top deck of the plane. This one woman wanted to be upgraded to one of the booths. These booths cost hundreds of pounds, and when she did not get the aforementioned upgrade, she flipped on my poor cousin. Story 32, not a flight attendant, but I was on a flight from Dubai to Houston a few years back. There was a little kid, maybe 5 or 6, behind me who had far too much energy. He was kicking my seat and pulling my hair. At one point, he took off my shitty airline headphones and put them on to listen. I asked for them back, but he just laughed at me. An hour or two later, when his parents noticed and told him to stop, he started yelling at them. Story 33, not a flight attendant, but a frequent flyer with 100K miles under my belt this year. I've seen many examples of entitled flying, and I'm sure I've seemed entitled to onlookers. But there's a big difference between trying to get the benefits allotted to you and trying to get things above what you deserve. The biggest problems I've seen is people getting angry at agents during delays and cancellations. I've seen many agents be screamed at for not immediately getting the passenger to their destination, which can be hard if there's a blizzard outside. More often than not, being nice to the agent will get you what you want and more. Although, that doesn't always work. Sometimes agents are just bad. Story 34, around 17 years ago, I was getting a flight from Frankfurt to Bagot. Second time flying, in a row in front of me, a guy with quite an unsanitary-looking beard was sitting there. 10 minutes after I was seated, a flight attendant and a woman started arguing with the guy, requesting him to take his own seat. 20 minutes arguing, the guy stands up and starts yelling, "Me siento, diened esse me de lagana, I will sit wherever I want," and sits down again. 5 minutes later, police arrive and request him to unboard the plane, starting a struggle with him, yelling, "Yo me siento, diened esse me de la pugana, and mi panos sentamus diened karamas," meaning I will sit wherever the foo I want. In my country, we seat wherever we want. It was not as dramatic as Delta Asia Medic scene, but the guy got a pair of police pea sticks to the head and dragged away handcuffed. At that time, I had around 12 and was seated away from my uncle and quite shocked at the scene. After the plane took off, and I had terrible 12 hours with motion sickness and puking all the way to Bagot. Story 35. This was unintentionally my fault as a terrible passenger. But while back, I hit the little light button because it was a nighttime flight and I wanted to read. There weren't many people on the flight, which is good, but I think I broke the light because it flashed like a strobe for a good portion of the flight. It blinked like 2 times a second, and it was so bright I felt terrible. Poor everyone else at it. OMG, what happened in the replies, LMAO. Story 36, obligatory, not a flight attendant. My mom and I were flying back to the States after visiting family in DR. I was a kid, like 7 or 8, but apparently there was some mix-up, and they somehow double-booked my mom's seat. We were there first, and the other lady who had the seat came by and demanded that my mom moved. She was traveling alone, so you'd think, logically, the person with the small child should stay, especially since we were there first, and there weren't any other seats right next to each other. But there were single seats, so it would be easier for her to relocate. But Nashi just screamed at my mother until eventually my mom gave up and took me to try finding seats close enough together that we wouldn't be separated. The lady tried stopping her and said I could stay with her, and apparently I went, "No. You're mean." I don't remember saying this, though, but I do remember being very WTF about her offering that. Thankfully, someone else moved to let us sit together, but I still have no idea what that lattice problem was, since it's not like the flight was 100 full, so she literally could have sit anywhere else. The seat wasn't even at the front or anything either.